Across higher education and instructional design, one practice is universally accepted. To help students succeed, you must provide explicit, highly detailed assessment criteria. The primary pedagogical goal here is straightforward. By sharing rubrics up front, instructors communicate their expectations precisely, removing ambiguity from the assignment. A secondary intended benefit is psychological. Knowing exactly how a grade is calculated demonstrably lowers student anxiety leading into high-stakes evaluations. Yet recent pedagogical research presents an empirical contradiction to these practices. Giving students a perfectly transparent map of the assessment does not automatically lead to better learning. This scatter plot maps the explicitness of rubric detail on the x-axis against student autonomy on the y-axis. As the rubric becomes more granular, a sharp negative correlation appears with the student's independent problem-solving capacity, a shift defined as criteria compliance. In practice, criteria compliance means students stop pursuing qualitative excellence in the subject matter. Instead, they optimize their effort to mechanically check the specific boxes listed on the page. The drive for perfect transparency frequently backfires. Making a rubric hyper-detailed actually restricts student autonomy, trapping learners in a rigid framework of compliance rather than fostering deep understanding. This paradox stems from a specific conceptual error in how institutions view assessment, termed the representational view. The representational view operates on the assumption that written words on a rubric hold a fixed, universal meaning. It assumes that every reader, regardless of their experience level, interprets the criteria exactly the same way. The critical blind spot of this framework is that explicit text simply cannot capture tacit knowledge. The nuanced, highly intuitive judgments required for advanced academic or complex professional tasks consistently defy simple categorization into boxes. Having perfect textual clarity on a printed page does not equal perfect cognitive understanding in the student's mind. To visualize the limits of explicit criteria, researchers rely on the iceberg model. The visible tip represents explicit written criteria given to students. The massive, hidden underwater base represents the complex network of tacit knowledge, the authentic professional practice that cannot be easily written down. Researchers like Behrman, Ajawi, Balan, and Johnson have investigated how students interact with this hidden layer when only provided the visible tip. Their central conclusion reveals that explicitly describing expectations does not result in a linear, predictable increase in student performance. Balan and Johnson's data isolates why this happens. The effectiveness of a rubric depends entirely on the student's baseline ability. For low-performing students, detailed rubrics cause a dramatic increase in self-efficacy. Novices need that explicit structure for basic orientation in an unfamiliar subject. High-performing students, however, show an anomaly. They frequently and actively ignore explicit criteria, choosing to bypass the instructions to preserve their own problem-solving autonomy. An explicit rubric functions as a necessary psychological safety net for novices, while simultaneously acting as a restrictive ceiling for developing experts. Resolving this paradox requires discarding the representational view in favor of the sociocultural view of assessment. The sociocultural view defines assessment transparency as the active process of anchoring isolated criteria to a broader community of practice. If rubrics are kept detached from authentic, messy practice, the criteria risk trivialization. The standards lose their meaning without context. Granger and colleagues tracked how to successfully transfer this tacit, contextual knowledge to students in practice. Students require regular access to authentic performance exemplars. To truly understand quality, learners must see actual completed work, not just read abstract rubric descriptions. Specifically, transferring complex guidance requires providing students with a wide range of both annotated and unannotated versions of these exemplars. Bauer and colleagues tested this by conducting empirical research that compared standard rubric usage directly against a method called learning by comparison. Comparative judgment operates by having students evaluate and compare actual peer essays against each other, rather than checking isolated work against a rubric checklist. This split bar chart comparing the two conditions shows a clear outcome. Students using comparative judgment generated significantly more higher-order feedback, focusing on text content and structural flow. Students isolated with only the written criteria produced restrictive, lower-order compliance, focusing heavily on grammar and formatting over substance. The ability to recognize true quality requires evaluating real flawed work. It cannot be achieved by memorizing an idealized abstract standard. A systemic review of rubric efficacy across different education levels by researcher Susan Brookhart highlights a major data anomaly in how these tools perform. In higher education environments, rubric interventions consistently show highly positive outcomes for student learning. In K-12 interventions, the results repeatedly show partial, small, or inconclusive impacts unless the intervention is sustained over many continuous weeks. The first variable causing this discrepancy is environment. Higher education operates in direct proximity to authentic professional practice. University geology students, for example, do not just read theory. They apply criteria directly while conducting physical lab and fieldwork, grounding the assessment in reality. The second variable is cognitive maturity. Older students possess a significantly higher baseline of self-regulation skills, including the ability to plan, monitor, and adjust their own behavior. A rubric's efficacy isn't derived from its formatting. It depends entirely on the maturity of the student's self-regulation and the authenticity of the task environment. Synthesizing this research, Janssen and Prince outline a final framework for achieving productive assessment transparency that supports learning without sacrificing student autonomy. It relies on 3 pillars. Pillar 1 establishes that criteria must function strictly as indicators of quality. This means the rubric should highlight the dimensions of quality a student should aim for. It must explicitly avoid dictating step-by-step instructional actions. Pillar 2 is the necessity of contextual anchoring. Criteria must be bound to a community of practice through exemplars and feedback. Institutions have to permanently strip away the illusion that a rubric is universally applicable outside its specific context. Pillar 3 is the requirement for explicit self-regulation training. Learner autonomy, self-evaluation, and self-regulation are not spontaneous personality traits. They are discrete cognitive skills that must be deliberately taught alongside the subject matter. For practitioners, this reveals the true nature of pedagogical transparency. False transparency is handing out a highly detailed document and expecting compliance. True transparency is actively socializing a student into the tacit, unspoken standards of a discipline. To build capable learners, designers must abandon the perfect paper rubric in favor of guiding students through the messiness of authentic professional practice.